Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to today's University of Texas Austin's Energy Symposium. I'm Kerry King, research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute here at the UT Austin. It's the sponsor of this series. Before I introduce today's speakers, I will point out the upcoming talks. Upcoming talks next week will be Jing Chen, who's a professor at the City College of New York, talking about water responsive materials for evaporation energy harvesting as a material scientist. The following week, we'll have a remote talk from Michael Holland from MIT, powering decarbonization with modeling and optimization of renewables in changing environment. But today, it is a good pleasure to be here in the LBJ School of Public Affairs with James Galbraith, who is the Lloyd and Bentsen Chair in Government Business Relations here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And his co-author in the book that they will speak about today, Jing Chen, who is a graduate of LBJ School here. And he is assistant professor of finance at the University of Northern British Columbia. Brief background on Dr. Galbraith, besides his title that I've already discussed. He was executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress in the early 1980s. Before that, an economist for the House Banking Committee. He has chaired the Board of Economists for Peace and Security from 1996 to 2016 and was managing editor of Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, a journal from 2010 to 2024. He's advised the State Planning Commission in China from 1993 to 97, Finance Ministry of Greece in 2015, and is presently serving pro bono as the chair of the Bilateral Economic Advisory Group to the Republic of Palau. Jing Chen teaches at finance at the University of Northern British Columbia, and he works in the foundational issues in economics, biology, and physics, something we'll hear about today. Very short abstract. I'm going to leave up the links for the reviews on their book, which they are speaking about today, but they're going to talk about their book, Entropy Economics, the living basis of value and production. That was published just this year, and I've read it, and I enjoyed the book very much, and I recommend it as well. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to their presentation, and let's welcome Dr. Galbraith and Chen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kerry, for having us. And let me just say, it's a pleasure. It's actually kind of a treat to be here and to be on my home turf to talk about this project, which is a book was published earlier this year, University of Chicago Press, entitled Entropy Economics, the living basis of value and production. It's a collaboration with my friend and co-author, Jing Chen, with whom I have been working now for, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so, roughly, though he lives and works in the remote province of Northern British Columbia under heavy snow most of the year. And we've only met in person, I suppose, for perhaps a half a dozen times. So it's been a very rewarding but long distance collaboration. The book itself is a small but fairly ambitious effort to recast the foundations of economic thought, of economic theory, of economic teaching, in a way that would bring it into a better accord, a better alignment with the thought processes that have been commonplace in other branches of science and social science for going on close to 2 centuries, but certainly since the middle of the 19th century. That is to say, the principles of evolution and the laws of thermodynamics, which are to a very substantial degree at odds with the way at least the basics of modern economics continue to be conceptualized and taught. So I want to start, first of all, by just giving you a brief caricature, if you like, of the standard textbook view in economics, which dates back at least to Adam Smith and his notion of the primary instinct of truck, barter, and exchange, which distinguishes humans from all other animals, in which, to this day, exchange is the primary economic activity. and economic life is organized around exchange institutions, which are called markets, which are the key structures of economic study. Prices are the means by which markets adjust, and the view of valuation is essentially the one that's been dominant since the start of the 20th century, at least maybe the late 19th, is that prices are fundamentally determined by the preferences of the market players, that is to say, by their underlying psychology, which is also expressed in terms of utilities and marginal utilities. Markets are presumed to be generally efficient, that is to say, they achieve the objectives that they are set out to achieve, except in a whole plethora of cases when they don't. And of course, the LBJ school exists to a large extent to study the cases where markets do not achieve their objectives, and then various interventions are required to move them closer to the presumptive ideal situations, social costs, externalities, public goods. You can go to the back chapters of any standard textbook and you'll come to a whole list of these problems. So there's a basis for a notion of a market efficiency and then a whole plethora of exceptions. Regulation then is brought into this picture to address the problem of allegedly exceptional but very common problem of market failure, that is to say, conditions that ought to be changed for one reason or another that is not taken care of in the interior of a market transaction. Once you have absorbed that basic concept, the pedagogy, and I remember this well from my own graduate education, moves on to the concept of production. And production is, as it turns out, treated conceptually in a way which is substantially analogous to exchange. That is to say, we think in terms of, or we're instructed in terms of something called a labor market, in which wages adjust to allocate people to activities according to their skills, capital markets in which finance is allocated according to the price determined in financial markets, which is the interest rate, and one can go down the list, but those are the essential categories that are presented to the at least to the introductory student. And the object of the whole exercise is to characterize a condition that is called equilibrium. Equilibrium is the state of balance, the state at which, if it is achieved, things will not tend to change on their own. And from that point forward, the system is, generally speaking, presumed to be stable unless it's disturbed. And disturbances then are conceptualized as something that comes from the outside. This is what we often speak in terms of shocks. The great financial crisis was a shock. The oil crisis was a shock. A war is a shock to a system which is presumed to be otherwise substantially stable. And technological progress that underpins and gives this system a certain dynamism is may not be steady in time, but it is unidirectional. As I say, it's always in the direction of improvement, which makes it a very big problem to incorporate, let's say, the challenge of a declining or collapsing economy within the paradigm. It has to be, again, something which is affected largely from the outside. So that's, I think, a fair, if rather crisp, an abbreviated characterization of the textbook view. And our experience and certainly my teaching and Jing's teaching over many decades, as well as experience in the real world before that, and education and a much broader tradition than was once very prevalent in economics even before that, has given us a quite different foundational basis for thinking about economic problems. In the first place, we would argue that the fundamental activity in economic life is not exchange, but production. Because if you haven't produced something, you've got nothing to exchange. And nothing comes from nothing. So one has to have a productive process before it's meaningful even to discuss what the exchange economy is going to do with that. That doesn't deny the existence of markets or their role, but places them in the context of a productive system. And once you recognize that, you come to grips with the fact that production is a process of transforming resources that are taken from the environment. And the environment, those resources have to be of a quality that can be characterized as low entropy or high quality. That is to say, they have to be extractable from the environment with a surplus in energy terms that one can use. If it costs more in energy to take something out of the environment for use than you get out of it, you don't do it. The ores are too, or the resources are too low quality, too deep, too difficult to extract, and they're left what they are. So you have to be able to access resources that will return something to you. In other words, have what, of course, any energy economist knows is a positive energy return on energy investment. Now, to get that, you have to have equipment. You have to have a machine. You have to have some kind of fixed investment. And by the way, this is not simply true of economic activity. It's true of biological and mechanical activity of all kinds. A leaf, in order to photosynthesize, needs to have, first of all, a cell that can convert sunlight into chemical energy and go right up the scale of complexity of activity. That's true of machine processes, and it's true of social processes. You need to have a technology that will enable you to get resources that you can use. And technologies are operated according to plans. Plans are an indispensable part of biological and mechanical systems. In our bodies, they're incorporated in our genes. In machines, they're incorporated in blueprints and machine diagrams and so forth. And in societies, that's regulations, habits, laws, constitutions, which differ from one society to another, but which govern and condition our behavior with respect to the use, extraction and use of resources. So planning is an integral piece of the economic process. It's not something that is sort of emerges out of the resolution of a market interaction, but something which is interior to that. Useful work, once you have resources that enable you to do useful work, depends on inequalities. And as someone who's spent many decades studying economic inequality and measuring that, and dealing with people for whom inequality is substantially a political issue and an ethical issue, this is an important realization that all activity requires differentials. Carnot's principle, differentials of temperature, differentials of pressure, and in economic life, differentials of income and wealth. I say to my students, why are you here? Well, they're here to get better jobs. They're here to get better incomes, to have more secure and successful existences. That's what we're supposed to give them an opportunity for. They're taking advantage of inequalities that are intrinsic to the society and that are not undesirable. And that becomes, a very important underlying realization, but it's coupled to a second realization, which is that all inequalities must be regulated, or they get out of control. Your blood pressure goes up too high. This is bad for your survival prospects. Your body temperature goes up too high. This is something that you typically need to treat. Your engine temperature goes up too high, your reactor temperature, and you're prone to a disaster. The pressure becomes too great on a dam, and it will fail. Income inequalities and wealth inequalities are analogous in that respect. If they move up too far or too quickly, that's typically a sign that the society is going to undergo some kind of stress and is moving toward a disaster. So systems that are sustained for a period of time are regulated systems. And markets, sophisticated markets, but even fairly simple markets in the kinds of societies in which we live, don't exist unless they have been created by regulatory structures. It's not something to add on to deal with an otherwise perfectible system. It is a precondition for the existence of that system. That is why we stop at red lights, even if there's no traffic. That is why we are carrying in our heads the consciousness of a whole stream of rules and regulations. Why we get on airplanes. We know there's an air traffic control system, or at least we hope there is. And on and on and on. That's why we eat raw vegetables, because we have some confidence that they're not contaminated with sewage. Somebody's looking out for this. Otherwise, we would chop and cook them at high temperatures before we consume them. And societies which do not have the confidence in the regulatory structures go through all kinds of trouble to protect themselves at lower levels. Boiling water in the household, simple example, but there are many, many of them. Okay, so regulation is essential. And then the final basic principle that I would offer here is that the more complex, sophisticated, and efficient a society or any process is, biological and mechanical processes as well, these are preconditions for a better life, but they're also more fragile. And that's a necessary feature of the system. That is to say, they're more prone to breakdown in crisis, and breakdowns in crises are part of the evolutionary process. They happen. And they happen, and part of the book deals with the conditions under which they are likely to happen. Okay, nothing lasts forever. All right, where am I? Okay. So we extend this argument and formalize it with the propositions dealing with a couple of very basic economic ideas. First one is value, and the second one deals with production. And here I have to really tip my hat to Jing Chen, who's as I am not, he came up in the world as a mathematician and absorbed a lot more physics than I did. But basically, this is a very simple representation of a theory of value. There is a value, of course, underpin economics. I mentioned that the neoclassical theory is based on psychology, but it competed for a time with other theories, of which a preeminent one was based on scarcity. Labor theory of value is a scarcity theory. We offer what is effectively a generalization based upon entropy, essentially, on the idea that a low entropy proposition, relatively scarce, translates to higher economic value. And there are basically two parameters in our exposition of this theory. The whole mathematics of it is right here. That is to say, P is a probability which represents scarcity, 0 over 1. And that gives you, as the things are more scarce, the more valuable. And secondly, the second major factor that determines economic value is control over the market. And an insight, which again I'll credit to Jing, is that when you use the logarithm function here to represent this, the base of the logarithm provides a very convenient way to represent the degree of control of the market. That is to say, as the base goes toward 1, you're approaching monopoly, and economic value will tend to go up. So it gives you an expression which is operational. You can put numbers into it, and this is a representation of how scarcity will decline as how value will decline as scarcity declines, essentially, and as the probability of a market saturation, if you like, of a commodity increases. And this is a representation of what happens as the base of the logarithm increases, essentially, as you move away from a monopoly position, the monopoly control over value declines rather rapidly and then continues to decline slowly as the numbers go up. So a perfectly competitive market is one in which that's not a factor, or a highly competitive market. And as a product moves through a cycle from being newly introduced and therefore scarce and likely introduced by a single player, which is to say, in a quasi-monopoly position, there's nothing saying it's a perfect monopoly, in a quasi-monopoly position, then as it moves toward having more competitors and greater market saturation, it becomes routine and therefore loses its glamour and its position as a source of major extraction of economic value. you can put this into a number of different contexts, and I'll just give you a flyby of one of them here, which is a question of what happens when you take a country which is relatively resource poor, let's call it the United States, and integrate it with another economy which is relatively resource rich, let's call it, for purposes of illustration, Venezuela. And you have a larger economy which combines the two of them. And the basic story is that the valuations in the resource poor region will tend to decline, and those in the resource rich region will tend to increase. So that you have a situation in which the consumers in the relatively resource rich poor region are benefiting. Producers in the relatively resource poor region are going to be relatively unhappy. So you have I think I got that right. Anyway, that gives you a sense of bringing the model into an operational context. I'll pass a little bit onto the theory of production and just say a few words about it. We can talk about it more, and I'm trying to wrap this up in a half an hour so we can have an exchange for the second half of the program. But the production decisions depend upon a range of factors, which I think are familiar to anybody who is familiar with business context. That is to say, output scale, the degree of fixed investment that's necessary, the variable cost, which is expected to be incurred as you go through a production process, how long a project's going to last, what's your discount rate, how quickly do you think you need to recover your costs, how much uncertainty, and put all those together and ask, what's the expected rate of return, what's the expected profit, enables you to make a decision which is never going to be a fixed or firm or concrete or certain decision, because the world isn't like that, about whether to produce or not to produce. And that all these various factors can be interacting. What we show in the book is that you can put them all basically into an equation, which I won't try to exhibit here, because it would get us into more complexity than I care to take time on, although we could take it up in the cost in the Q&A. But basically, you can interact these factors. You can interact fixed and variable costs under different conditions of uncertainty, the rate of return under different levels of fixed costs, fixed and cost and present value, project duration and present value, and so on and so forth, the various interactions. And I'll show you just a few examples of this. Here is a case where we are comparing low and high fixed cost activities across a scale of output and rate of return. And what the two curves show you is that if you start with a low fixed cost investment, you have a lower break-even point at which the curve rises above the zero line, but you also have a lower ultimate rate of return. And so higher fixed cost activities, bigger dams, bigger reactors, bigger machines, bigger systems, bigger countries, require higher skills of operation to break even, but they're also likely to be more profitable under the same conditions in the higher scales of output. On the other hand, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier, that as increased uncertainty increases with particularly unanticipated uncertainty as between low and high fixed cost activities. You can compare the initial expectation in the first two columns with the actual result in the second two columns. And you find that what happens if the uncertainty level is higher is that the larger investment incurs a bigger one. And that's a perfectly, I think, intuitive and reasonable result and expectation. And again, tells you that when you're making a bigger bet, you're taking a bigger risk. And if you were right and conditions continue to be stable, it pays off. And if you were wrong, you get hit with a much larger loss. So it comes back to the proposition I was articulating at the beginning, that the more complex a system, the more fragile it is. This is very closely related to the insight of a friend of mine many years ago, Hyman Minsky, thinking had a large impact on anybody who knew him, which is that stable situations tend to be intrinsically destabilizing. And this emerges as essentially from the argument that we make in the mathematical proposition that again, low uncertainty favors higher fixed cost projects, but they do worse if uncertainty increases. Okay. What about resources? When resources are cheap, there is a strong incentive to go big. So when oil was struck in Texas in 1930 in vast quantities, and on through the 40s and 50s of the last century, this fostered a vast increase in the fixed investment, the interstate highway system, the airline system, everything that was oil using. It gives you a capacity to take advantage of this low cost resources. But when the resources are more expensive and harder to access, that advantage of large scale in terms of high rates of return tends to disappear. And they fall to zero eventually. So that if you have facing a situation in which resource costs are going up because the pool of resources that you originally had access to depleted, the new ones are not being accessed with the same degree of efficiency, you have to realize that that's going to cause a real change in the profitability of major fixed investments going forward. And I think this is basically the same point, but this one illustrates for a given large-scale project, what happens as resource costs rise. Okay. General conclusions. And I'll then turn it over to Jing if you want to make any comments to follow up. But just generally, we believe that what we have done in this small book is to present some foundational concepts for thinking about real-world problems, real-world conditions. They place the quality of resources very much at the heart of the issue. And I have to say, being in Texas and having been here for 40 years, I find this extremely interesting. We were commenting just over coffee a few minutes ago, that if you think innovation and entrepreneurship are the key to economic growth, that idea is from California. If you think saving, the old Victorian virtue of the wealthy person who saves and invests for the society, that idea originates in London and lives in New York. That's a finance idea. But if you're here, you know that the foundation of economic prosperity is access to low entropy, high quality resources, and especially energy resources, because they underpin the acquisition of every other kind of resource. And it is a problem that they don't get credit for, and a problem often, though not necessarily at the present moment, but often, that they don't earn a return that justifies the acquisition or the development of resources in a serious way. So one might assume that those resources are going to be available indefinitely, and you might be right, but who knows how long the Permian Basin will continue to bubble up, which it has been doing for the last decade or so. And this is a fundamental problem with which mainstream economics seems not to want to come to grips. I looked yesterday at the forthcoming articles in the American Economic Review, 20 or 30 of them, not one of them dealt with resource questions. Not all. All about some sort of floating on the surface of market equilibrium processes of various kinds. They're not focused on this question. They think the resource sector is a small share of GDP, can't be that important. Get rid of oil. Yeah, it takes 2% of GDP, 3%, so what? You can get the other 97%. Jing lives in northern British Columbia where there are gold mining towns. And in those gold mining towns, what was the one that was the largest one? Yeah, in the 19th century, largest town in North America, in Western North America. And if you looked at its GDP, it was full of hotels and bars and taverns and brothels and God knows what. And its GDP was only very slightly dependent on gold, except when the gold mine ran dry. The rest of it just disappeared. And it sits there in the barrens of northern British Columbia, or the Yukon Territory, empty, because there's no basis in resources for the activity that it once supported. So resource quality has to be thought of as really very fundamental in a way which has not been the case. And economic processes require valuation, production decisions that have fixed investments that are in processes are inherently dynamic, inherently unstable, and therefore we operate without any concept of equilibrium, certainly in the long term. When you think about homeostasis, that is, say, keeping the system going for a long, substantial period of time, a regulated process. But there's no expectation that it will continue indefinitely, and lots of expectation that if you slip in the control of the system, it will break down. And therefore, our objective as policy, as advisors or thinkers about the policy process, is to think about how you keep the process going in a satisfactory way for as long as you can, and how you prepare for the very likely eventuality that that's not going to happen forever. So we'll wish ourselves good luck with that. And in the immortal words of a certain political figure I'm sure you're familiar with, thank you for your attention to this matter. Okay.
Presentation with your pictures. Go ahead. Okay. You want to show anything from the slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Just go backwards.
Okay. Sure. I'll go back. Okay. Okay. So thanks, Carrie, for giving us opportunity to give a talk here, and I'm very grateful for Jamie. He helped me so much for so many years. And if you work in economics or academia, probably know that if you develop an idea, right, is against the mainstream, so you are in big trouble, right? So I really appreciate Jamie for all his help and protection over many years. Okay, so we just maybe elaborate a little bit over Jamie's lecture. Okay, so here we see the definition value, right? Definition value. People say, okay, you come from physics, right? This is the same definition in physics. So physics is objective, but we human beings live in a subjective society. That's why value is a utility. It's not something like objective, like entropy. So to this, we might think about information theory. So when information theory developed, it's the same formula, right? It's not same, but here the B is 2, right? B is 2 because in information, this is a bit, right? 0, 1, so the choice of 2. So there's the 2, but other than that, it's identical. And people also thought, well, for information theory, right? Information is subjective, but this information theory is objective. How can you capture the essence of information? To that, actually, information theory does not capture everything about information, but it captures the cost of information transmission, right? And that is extremely important. For example, when we watch a video, right? Because we know the information theory, we can suppress the amount of information code 100 times. So we can watch video very easily. Without the theory, we would have to be transmitted at very, very high cost. So this is, it's very important for us modern society. And the same is here. We don't claim this simple formula capture everything, okay? But it's essentially captured the two most important factors about valuation. One is scarcity, one is the level of monopoly. And you can see in our society is really organized either in monopoly or you try very hard to achieve monopoly. For example, a state, right? A state is an identity that have a monopoly on violence, taxation, printing money, right? And the law, right? So it has a monopoly. So you can see the form of state is so successful, now become the universal form, right, of society. And also about religion, right? There monotheism and polytheism. But earlier religion mostly are polytheism. But now over time we can see, right? It's the monotheism becomes so dominant in our society, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? So this is here again. This B is the one or approach to one, and other organizations you see like unions, like patents, like regulations, often try to achieve monopoly or oligarchy, right? So you can see that these two factors, this B and P, these are very, very important. And same is for production theory, right? So if you look at this production theory in standard economic theory, for example, let's say this year's Nobel Prize go to a paper by Ajun and Howitt, and in their paper, the production theory is simply called is a power function. Power function. It keeps growing, right? Keeps growing. So, go ahead. So this means from their assumption, the economy will never decline anyway. So there's no way the economy could decline, and there's nothing about the resource. So, for example, if Texas does not produce any oil, it doesn't matter at all. But why we care about oil so much, right? All our foreign policies, we try to get our oil, and we try to block oil, or natural gas, for example, Nord Stream pipeline blow up, right? Why there are so many military activities with high cost to either get oil or to prevent others from getting oil. But we just could not understand all these real life activities. But with us, we know that, okay, so because any activities like you want to say, you want to like, for example, when you want to achieve this, when the resource is a lot, you can have a large market size and you can invest heavily, right? So the amount of investment is actually, depends on the amount of resource you can get. So this it really explains a lot, like why in different areas, social structure different, and also in our living system, why there are a lot of big animals, but there are a lot more small animals. They can utilize a small niche in life. So our theory is quite consistent with either our society or bigger part biology, Yeah. Yeah, I think, so there's some time left, so we can discuss. And you have any questions, we can just pass together, explore together. Okay. Yes. So Carrie, so
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're open to questions in the room, as well as there's one online here that I'll start with. Nobody has one, so if you have a question in the room, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. All right, so I'll go online first and then in the room. So here's a question online. The value of nature in its various forms is generally not included in economic modeling. How can we bring the valuation of nature into economics and politics? For instance, Milton Friedman noted we should charge for damage to the commons. Oil and gas production damages the environment and our health at no cost to producers and use of the product. So how do we think about valuing nature?
I'm sorry, Carrie, I couldn't make out a word you were saying.
Oh, right. As a question about how do we value nature in economics, or how should we value nature? And the person posing the question has indicated that even Milton Friedman said that we should charge when someone damages the commons, but we seem not to be doing this.
That's a question which is a little bit above my pay grade, because nature is not an economic commodity. How do you value the universe? Right? So it's that at least is not directly reached by the expression that we're offering here. Jing, you want to?
Yeah, so we want to talk about, right, both, right? So the benefit, for example, the oil generate pollution, right? But at the same time, it more importantly, it gives us a lot of, for example, we fly in planes, drive cars, right? You can compare both. If we think, okay, so the pollution is worse than all the convenience, so we will not use this oil, right? And when we explore oil, there's a compensation. Actually, there are a lot of environmental regulations say that about the cleanup, the cleanup.
Yeah,
So they're all there. And also, you look at the societies with or without this use of oil, you can see that if you look at the poor society, we think, oh, it's green, but the reality is not the case. In all the poor society do not use oil. They are all very barren. Why is that? Because, I mean, if you have any experience, you will notice because they cut along all the trees to as a fuel, right?
Yeah.
In cooking, I mean, anyone has any experience with those real poor society, you know that those are the environment are extremely degraded, Because I came from such an environment, It's just everywhere just dirt. Because anything that grows, I mean, a little bit higher, people will cut out because we don't have fuel. We don't have fuel. So only after the introduction of these fossil fuels, there's greenness in the countryside.
So, yeah, just put it maybe the same way, but if you look at the expression, which is a summation of valuations, and add in the byproducts of a mining process or an extraction process of some kind, including the air pollution and the land pollution, the water pollution and so forth, all the materials, and you made it necessary to clean those all up, it's obvious that that's going to reduce the economic value of the thing that you're aiming to extract. Which is why, of course, mining companies don't want to do that. They want to take the rent from and the valuation from the low entropy product that they are actually interested in, and leave the rest to sit on the ground for future generations to experience the consequences of it. Resource extraction is basically like that. The more you internalize the byproducts onto the company, the less profitable and the less attractive it is to get the resources in the first place. That's a dilemma.
Thank you for raising such incredibly important questions. You mentioned one quantity that we know we can't do without, which is energy, and particularly sources such as oil. There are others, like food, that I think we would not be willing to substitute freely for all other things. I love bicycles, but if you made me take all of my food in the form of bicycles, I would not be willing to make the trade. How can one tell what those quantities are that cannot be substituted for anything else, independent of how they show up in a cost share equation?
Sorry, say that again, Michael.
How can one tell which quantities really cannot be substituted for other things, no matter how small they may appear to be in a cost share equation?
Oh, that's a very good question. What do you think, Jing?
Okay. So, but that's a very good question. Okay, so, so you see here, right? A lot of things, substitute or non-substitute. We, for example, in the early time of a life system, right? We don't use this solar energy. So solar energy is not part of this energy consideration for the Earth's life, right? But later, the solar energy, when living system develop photosynthesis, it becomes the most dominant energy source, right? So this means with different kind of technology. So when we say substitute or not, they can be different at different stage, right? For example, when we say develop technology, iron making, and iron making, so the iron is so plenty, iron ore is so plenty, but the technology at that time used charcoal to produce iron. So the resources to make iron is only local, because charcoal, the wood is very difficult to move around, right? And the charcoal is very, so that constrains the size of the iron production. And what triggers the industrial revolution is the technology can use coal to make iron. And at that time, coal become a substitute for charcoal. And as a result, the iron production increased tremendously. And that is the beginning of the industrial revolution. And then we say oil. Right now, the predominant resource we use is oil. But the exploration for oil, the technology is a lot more complex. So for a long time, oil is not a substitute for coal, right? It takes a lot of time, and especially after the World War I, so people see how powerful this oil-based this technology, right? Like tank, like airplane are very, very powerful. So everyone rushed to develop this technology to how to explore, right? Find oil. And as a result, in roughly 10 or 20 years, new technology developed. So we can explore oil with a lot of great precision. And that's when the oil boom came. And as a result, oil becomes the substitute, right?
Let me offer another way of, maybe this began the same way, but in different words. One of my early teachers, Joan Robinson, had this expression, that capital was putty play. That is to say, ex ante, before you decided what to do with it, you could do lots of different things. But once you've committed to a particular technology, you have made certain restrictions on the substitutability. And those restrictions stay in place for as long as you're committed to that particular technological model. That is to say, that once you start building automobiles, you're basically committed to liquid fuel. Once you start building aircraft, you're basically, again, the same. And one can go down the list. Once you start building advanced semiconductors, to take a very current example, it seems that you're basically committed to gallium, and therefore to the country that controls 98% of the world's supply, because it controls a very large share of the world's aluminum production, which is to say China. And you don't, once you've committed to that technology, you don't have another option. In the long run, maybe you can do without those semiconductors. We certainly did without them for many years. Maybe you could do without oil. We certainly did without that, except for the whales in the 19th century. But it's not clear that you could do without them at the same standard of living, the same population base, with the same technical capability. In fact, it's quite clear you couldn't. So those substitution parameters would seem to me depend upon your time horizon and the time it would take you to turn over and, for that matter, experience technological regress. And one can ask what's going to happen to our energy supplies over time. And, you know, speculation in the book is that we'll exhaust the high quality resources, the ones that are really efficient. Natural gas will go first. I don't know how much there is, but we're burning it at a very rapid rate. And, you know, you deplete the oil supplies, and then the Permian eventually dries up. And what do we have? Lots and lots and lots of coal. And then you go back and ask, well, what can you do with the coal? And, you know, the answer is, you can do with it a lot, but can you do it with 8 billion people? Who knows? That's another question.
Right. There's a couple more questions online and one in the room. Let me follow up on what you said in answering this last question and what you said during the presentation, Jamie, which is the sort of Hyman-Minsky that stability can sort of bring on destabilizing effects itself. Is that kind of what you mean, in the sense that if you're very stable and you have long-lived investments, that the destabilization can come if there's a disruption, and now these high fixed cost investments are now no longer going to be profitable?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the
Absolutely.
okay, good.
And you can easily see that happening. Again, let's come back to this very current case of gallium. The price, let alone the availability, the price could go up to a point where the technologies are no longer profitable. Right? And then you have to question, do you invest in them at a loss, draining resources from every other kind of activity? That's a formula for impoverishment. Or do you abandon them altogether? That's a formula for technical regress and for not having the capabilities that those things can give you. And those get to be very hard choices that people do not wish to face, do not wish to make, are unlikely to be made in a rational way. And so what happens next is you see a breakdown in the system where it breaks at the weak points. We make the argument in the book, by the way, that this is roughly what happens in the Great Depression. The Texas oil fields come online in 1930, and it's not coincidental that the coal-based, railroad-based, urban center-based economy collapses in 1930. Because it's immediately apparent that a new technical paradigm will be required. And along a few years later comes Roosevelt and the New Deal with the strong support of the Texas economic class. Jesse Jones, whose building, the communications building is named after him, was the finance director of the New Deal, ran the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and created the world of airfields and highways. I like to tell the story that in 1930, my father emigrated from Canada to the United States, across Lake Erie to Cleveland from Port Talbot, Ontario. And with another student, he bought a Model T and drove across the United States to take a graduate fellowship at the University of California at Berkeley. And he noted that from Lincoln, Nebraska to the California line, there were no paved roads. There were no paved roads, dirt all the way. And by the end of the 1930s, the New Deal had paved 700,000 miles of roads, about 1 million kilometers. What were they paved with? Asphalt, oil. It was the creation of an oil-based economy. We think of the New Deal in terms of Social Security and the Public Works Administration and so forth, but it was also the transformation of oil and electrification, as we know well in the Texas Hill Country because of the Lyndon Johnson story.
We're going to get to this question in the room. Sorry, but this question online is a good follow-up to what you just said. So the question online is, how do we justify money spent on the common goods or public goods despite the perhaps non-profitability or low profitability of public goods? So is this an intrinsic value problem or a subjective value? So you brought up the New Deal and sort of public investment. So kind of how do we view your theory and what you're talking about here and public investment versus private investment? And how does public investment, are they stepping in to make up for things private investment is not doing that could be informed by what your book is discussing?
I would argue that the United States built up as a society in a period of abundant resources and a great deal of world power, let's call it a superstructure of activity, which fed and feeds off of those power structures. And the two major ones are finance and the military. And the military represented by a worldwide network of bases and a worldwide fleet of major ships, aircraft, nuclear weapons, stuff like that. And these things are locked into a technical paradigm that is, as we illustrate, rapidly becoming unprofitable. Technology has has superseded much of the equipment that we use, and the world's financial systems are beginning to close in on the financial structures that are now such a very, very large piece of our economic activity. So something has to give. And there are basically three possibilities. You can retool the two I've just mentioned and reduce them in scale. And then you have resources to support the living standard of the population. Or you can cut the living standard of the population. You can cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps. And you can cut environmental protections, and we can all live with more trash and pollution and less safety and everything else. Worse schools, fewer teachers, less well-prepared teachers, all the things that have made the life of the society agreeable and tolerable can be cut back in order to support the things that are increasingly demanding resources without yielding anything to the larger society in turn. To me, the choice is clear, but it's equally clear that the political power rests with the entrenched interests. And that's a formula that will lead to increasing stress, is already leading to increasing stress, has already produced the political result that we're presently living with. It's what's going on. It defines the politics of the country at the moment, it seems to me.
All right, so thank you for the talk. I was curious about how do you think about scarcity? I'm having a hard time defining the idea of available amount. I mean, whenever I think of a resource, it's not clear to me what the actual amount of that resource is, because technology continuously is going to be changing what amount is available. I'm curious about how do you define actually scarcity? It seems that you have an assumption that there's a finite amount of each resource.
Sure.
Okay, so let's come here. Okay, the same problem, right? So look at something more concrete. For example, gold, right? Gold. So its scarcity is quite well defined, right? Like something like gold, because we know how much gold is roughly around, right? So it's very well defined. And the other resources, for example, sunlight. Sunlight, you say, oh, okay, sunlight is so abundant. Yes, we are very fortunate, very close to the sun. But if you look at the whole solar system, you can see sunlight is very, very scarce. For example, if you go to just one, our neighbor planet, Mars, right? The sunlight is already very scarce. And go over Mars, and it's extremely, extremely cold. So, and if you look at the volume, right? Volume that the sunlight can reach, and with like Earth temperature, is very, very tiny area of the universe, right? Because the most vast amount of the universe is very cold, like 2 degree Kelvin, 2 degree Kelvin. So we are around 300 Kelvin degree. So this means that our temperature is very, very scarce from the universe scale. So when you talk about scarcity, you usually want to say, okay, so what is the base, right? What's the base? So when we talk about how life is precious, we talk about base, whole universe. So why it's very rare for a life to occur. And something else, we say, okay, the goal, right? The amount is quite well defined, so the scarcity is defined. And what about oil or coal? And oil and coal, so we think, okay, oil is very abundant, coal is very abundant, but it is the result of many, many millions of the deposit, right, from ancient this life form, ancient life form, like hundreds of millions of years. But we are usually hundreds of years. If you look at time interval, is very, very short. So hundreds of years versus millions of years. And then time interval is very, very scarce. And that's why we say, okay, the high prosperity we enjoy in this society probably is short-lived. So that's the time scarcity in the time interval.
All right.
So, does it make sense? I think that way. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, perhaps end on this kind of general question from online. Just kind of a forward-looking question, I guess. What is keeping you awake at night? And what's the thing that we, define we however you like, what's the thing that we are not doing that we should be doing more and urgently? I guess you can go from practical to theoretical. Should we just be teaching economics differently? Should we be making investments differently? But what should we be doing going forward?
Try again, Gary, because
it's just a
microphone.
It's just a forward-looking question on what should we be doing going forward? What are urgent things that we should be doing? And we is open-ended here.
We being
The question is just we, so we can.
Right, well,
United States or humanity.
as Shakespeare did not say, the first thing I would do is burn all the economics textbooks. One has to begin by changing manners of thinking. And fortunately, that process has already happened almost everywhere throughout natural and even social sciences. They have become disciplines which are informed by physical, biological, and engineering realities. And what you do, you who are engaged in the study of energy systems, is very reasonable. It's very reasonable. But then if you look at the sociology of the university, the education system, you find that there's this enclave that's relatively isolated from this larger modern discourse. And why is that? Why is the study of economics such an insular phenomenon, such that you can only get an appointment in a so-called self-regarding economics department if you publish in one of 5 journals, all of whom adhere to the same intellectual tradition, which has become dominant only in the last 50 years. That wasn't the case before. Wasn't the case when I was growing up. It certainly wasn't the case in my father's time. Far from it. Become that way. But why is it? Well, economics plays an important role as a buttress of a given view of society, in support of a certain social order. That's a straightforward proposition, it seems to me. But that view is rooted in an earlier time, in a time that we would now recognize as essentially pre-scientific, as essentially rooted in the, not quite in theology, but in the Enlightenment's revision of the theological view, the 18th century, which was certainly a time of progress and transformation, but one which got very deeply disturbed by the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, and all the political upheavals that occurred, political and social upheavals that have occurred since then, which have given a very different flavor to the study of human societies. And it's rooted in Darwin and Marx and in the advances in physics, especially in the advances in physics. So if one could bring economics into conversation with what those of you who are connected to the real world already do, you could make an enormous difference in the way in which a large body of young people coming up are educated, and they would become much more sensitive to the kinds of problems that they're inevitably going to face. And they wouldn't be led around by economists who say, when there's some big disaster happens, like the great financial crisis of 2008, no one could have foreseen it. I heard that so many times, knowing that the people I knew and respected foresaw it just before it happened in principle, and months and relatively short periods before it happened in practice. But they were nobodies. And since they were nobodies, they didn't count. And all the people who didn't foresee it gathered around and protected themselves by saying it was a shock to an otherwise stable system. And I say nonsense. It was an intrinsic feature of a system. And we wrote about this. We did a piece in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. Why was financial fraud so preeminent in the years of 2000 and 2008? Because it was very difficult to make an honest profit. And as it became more difficult to make an honest profit, you faked it. You faked the books. That was Enron, that was Tyco, that was WorldCom, and that was the whole mortgage mania going up to the crash. It was very easy to see that this would end badly sooner or later if you were just focused on what was actually the underlying stresses to the situation, and how businesses who are obliged to report profits, they want to maintain their values in the market, were induced. In fact, the whole system subverted by that incentive structure. It wasn't meant to do that. So I'm just saying that there's a body of people who do not assert themselves into the economic sphere, who understand how the world works, and who ought to have much more sway over how students are taught than they do.
Yeah, that's all.
Anything more? No.
Okay, so what's that question?
The question is just kind of forward-looking, what should we be doing?
I think, from evolutionary perspective, we survive not because we have foresight. So what happens 100 years from now? Because we survive because we are good at competing with, especially we human beings are the most dominant species. This means our competition is mostly with our other human beings. So if you can do well in society if you are socially competitive. This means your ideas are almost identical with others, but only slightly better than others. So you can communicate well with others, and then you can gain power. So being a foresighted is not very conducive to evolutionary advantage. That is why it's difficult to say you see something happening, and then you can say you warn it, and your warning will be heeded. And if you look at history, usually it's not because the very dominant society that have all the resources and find the right way to the future. It's usually this kind of society collapse, and other less well-developed society and a simpler society and emerges as a result, whether it's a human society or different species. For example, it is only after these big dinosaurs went extinct that mammals can rise to dominance. So my guess is that it's similar, right? In human societies, it's very difficult for the very dominant class to let the voice be heard, because it's not conducive to their interest, but others are less resourceful by necessity. They have to adopt. Yeah, by necessity.
All right. Well, thank you for discussing different types of ideas and enabling this kind of discussion on the campus here at University of Texas at Austin. Let's thank Jamie Gabriel and Jing Chen. Thank you very much.